Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today, episode 159. And with Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving that is, coming fast upon us here, I wanted to revisit this idea of the Pilgrims and the lumber trade during the 1600s. What was it? Episode 68, I think. I talked about how, 64, sorry. I talked about how the Pilgrims were actually, some of them were lumbermen who were hired by various trade entities like the Dutch East India Company, as well as the British Royal Navy, to actually go and survey land for potential lumber acquisition. So I'm revisiting that. You know, it's a seasonal time. Thanksgiving is upon us. Let's talk about it again. So thank you for tuning in, whether you're watching it on YouTube or just listening onto your favorite pod-catching app or on my website, lumberupdate.com. Certainly every now and then people actually go there and listen to or even watch the show on the site. And of course, lumberupdate.com is where you can go to submit questions for the show. You can also just email me, lumberupdate@gmail.com. You can find me on Instagram at lumberupdateshow, and you can DM me and submit your questions that way as well. I actually got, I think all of the questions this particular month are from Patreon supporters. So if you are so inclined and want to support the show, go to patreon.com/lumberupdate. You can sponsor the show for $1 or $2, or you can be one of the fancy, super sexy people and sponsor at the walnut tier, and you get stickers sent to you every month. Like this last month, I sent out ponderosa pine. Next episode, I'll be featuring other species and shipping out stickers for those as well. I've got this deal running through the month of October and November where purchasing the halfway point in November, anybody who joins Patreon at that walnut tier is not only going to get the sticker for the current month, but they're gonna get 6 other stickers. A lot of you guys taking advantage of this. Thank you so much. And also just thank you for supporting the show. And I love getting these stickers into the hands of people. I love hearing from people who've gotten their stickers and done certain things with them. I've now gotten photographs of various lumber yards around the country who have these stickers posted on the wall or stuck to cabinet doors and things like that. It's just great to see these being used as resources, which ultimately was my idea for creating these kind of technical snapshots of certain species and having a lot of fun with those featured species episodes. Gotten a lot of great feedback on the ponderosa pine. Several people said it was more of a storytelling episode. I don't know. I felt like I was rattling off facts left and right, but maybe I just really like ponderosa pine. I did want to touch on one little industry thing. I've talked about Inventwood in the past. This is the company that is essentially creating compressed lumber, but not compressed in the way that we talked about in our compressed lumber episode, more of removing the lignin and compressing the empty space that the lignin is left behind. Inventwood is now shipping. So they've got their facilities up in Frederick, Maryland. I still have not been able to get in contact with anybody. I've gotten several automated replies from them. And I think they're kind of running everything. They've certainly gotten a lot of media inquiries. I don't know that I'm big enough news, frankly, to get them excited to talk to me, but maybe at some point in the future, I'll certainly be looking for them at the International Builders Show this coming February and hoping to get some time to talk to them then. But they have begun shipping. They're really focusing on exterior cladding at this point. If you are interested in getting some of the material, you can actually put down a deposit to hold your place in line. It's a little bit unorthodox, but I think, hopefully that means they've got a lot of interest in the product, and you're essentially, from what I understand, it is a refundable deposit. You're basically putting down a deposit. I don't know off the top of my head how much that deposit needs to be, but you're putting down a deposit to hold your spot in line. And if your spot comes up and you're not interested anymore, I believe they will refund that deposit. Don't quote me on that, but that's the process. They've gotten a little bit more specific at this point where they are asking people to fill out a form saying what you're looking for, like what you're looking to use it for, etc. So they can, I think, segment you and respond in accordance. But if you are interested in getting your hands on some Inventwood material to play around with it, you can put down some money and get some material. I haven't seen any kind of minimum order amounts either. So yeah, Inventwood is certainly shipping. Inventwood.com. Check them out. But let's move on to my main topic here, because I'm kind of excited about this. The whole idea of the Pilgrims being lumber brokers for basically the British Crown. It's always been an interesting thought in my head, and certainly you had the religious sect of the Pilgrims, the Puritans. Were the Pilgrims and the Puritans the same thing? I feel like they were slightly different sects. Regardless, someone can correct me on this, but you had obviously the religious persecution that drove the Pilgrims to move to the New World, and they had bought passage on the Mayflower, but there were other people on the Mayflower that weren't necessarily Pilgrims, and those were lumber merchants. I wanted to take a broader look at the lumber trade in colonial North America, specifically the colonial United States, the British holding, and kind of look at it from the period of the Pilgrims in like the early 1600s to 1620s up until the Revolutionary War, when, well, for obvious reasons, lumber export kind of ground to a halt at that point because we were at war with the mother country. So really, from the arrival of the Pilgrims in New England to the eve of that Revolutionary War is the period that I want to look at. And ultimately, wood was an extremely vital resource and a major export commodity for the American colonies. We had abundant virgin forests that provided raw material for certainly the homes, the settlements that we were building, but then also for shipbuilding and, of course, for fuel. And this was already at a time where Europe's forests were depleted, specifically Great Britain on a tiny little island that had already logged the crap out of their forests. And a lot of Europe, France and Spain, were in the same boat. I mean, those three countries have been fighting each other for hundreds of years, literally the 100 Years' War, and had been using wartime resources. Wood was the number one resource. So Europe was already depleted and pretty much unable to meet their local demand. So over the course of the 17th and 18th century, the colonial lumber industry has evolved massively from kind of subsistence, just survival use, to this booming export trade for timber, for ship masts, naval stores, things like tar, pitch, turpentine, etc., all tree extractives that supplied British shipyards and a variety of global markets. So, that's kind of the great snapshot. I wanted to dig in a little bit further, and forgive me, I've got some pretty extensive notes on this to make sure I get my facts straight here. But if we start in the early 1600s, when the earliest settlers arrived, they found forest, like everything blanketed in forests from the coast out to the Great Plains. Timber was, of course, immediately crucial for survival. The colonists needed wood to build shelters, build forts, fortifications, defensive foundations. They needed tools, axe handles, and things like that. And of course, they needed to stay warm. They needed firewood. Trees were all felled for this. The Pilgrims at Plymouth specifically built their first houses entirely from the local timber in about 1620 to 1621. At that point, they thought, well, maybe we can raise some additional cash. Remember, there were some people on the Mayflower that were timber merchants. They were already surveying the land for the crown. So the Plymouth settlers thought, let's raise some cash. Let's try our hand at exporting wood. In 1621, they loaded the ship Fortune, full of clapboards bound for England. And the earliest accounts basically just say generically clapboards, which could mean everything from, clapboards like we think of in modern day society as in like clapboard boards for siding, but also basically blanks. Could everything from barrel staves to what we might think of as construction lumber, 2x type lumber, but then also thinner clapboards. I mean, they were sawing logs and taking basically 100% yield from the log almost, putting it into a ship's hold and shipping it out. So this idea, that initial shipment, I don't have a lot of data on, like, did they make any money on it? Probably not, because ultimately this export for the Plymouth plantation proved really unsustainable. The colonists soon realized that their own need for timber was just too great to spare any export material. And it wasn't so much that they didn't have enough wood, but they only had so much manpower to actually fell trees, saw into boards, etc., to build their own houses, to fortify their settlement, to become a self-sustaining settlement, that by 1626, they'd given up on export entirely, and the Plymouth colony leaders actually passed an ordinance prohibiting anyone from selling or shipping timber out of the colony without approval in order to prevent a local shortage. So they had cleared land right around the Plymouth plantation, and to go further afield, certainly, you could walk and get to more trees, but the further you had to walk, the more effort that it took. These forests were abundant, but hauling wood was incredibly labor intensive. And these early settlers had to basically prioritize using it to establish the community rather than a profit industry. They needed wood just to survive, not as a way to make extra cash. Cash was frankly irrelevant because they were in kind of a barter trade society, and what they weren't trading, they were consuming to make tools to fell the next tree to burn so they didn't freeze to death. They were using it to make tools to harvest the wheat that they were growing, etc. Like, it was absolutely to make ends meet, to keep ourselves from dying. That's what the wood was being used for. So profit was the last thing they were thinking about. If we go a little further afield, like heading south down to Jamestown, this first colony founded in 1607, the London Company had also eyed that for timber exports. So we had lumber merchants on the Mayflower. Also, what was the ship that landed in Jamestown? I should know this. I've been to the Jamestown settlement so many times in my trips to Williamsburg, whatever. The ships that landed and continue to land in Jamestown had lumber merchants from the London Company on them, and they were eyeing these timber exports. In 1608, one of these guys wrote a very excited letter to the London Company saying there are abundant, goodly tall trees and lots of sweet wood found all across Virginia. Probably referring to sassafras, very fragrant wood, or possibly cedar. Both of those had market value in Europe. So the English then sent small shipments of lumber back home almost immediately of this sweet Virginia wood. And we thought, okay, we were establishing a trade here. But these efforts were kind of immediately hampered by just the desperate conditions of the Jamestown colony during the 1609 to 1610 starving time, as it was called. Rightfully so. People were starving and dying. A large portion of the Jamestown population just perished, and any timber enterprise stalled because, again, we need lumber just to survive. We need food just to survive. In the 1610s, Virginia really their focus rather shifted towards more profitable tobacco farming and consuming wood for building tobacco barns and hogsheads, or barrels, as you might say, rather than the export of timber itself. It was the export of hogsheads of tobaccos and building things for the process, the harvesting, the curing, drying, etc. of tobacco. So it wasn't timber export for timber's sake. It was timber export products made from timber. By the mid-1600s, however, colonial populations had grown and stabilized, and they weren't quite, it was still, surviving, but it wasn't quite on the knife edge. So lumber began to emerge as a possible trade good. So, we're talking 30 years down the road, maybe 50 years down the road, depending on whether you're in Plymouth or Jamestown. Colonists had cleared land for farms, and they were starting to generate surplus wood. So they learned about the export value of some particular products like barrel staves specifically. We think now of like tertiary, quaternary lumber being used for crate and packing material. Well, the number one crate and packing material back then was barrels of some sort. Everything from, hogsheads to barrels to kegs to casks, all of those different sizes. If you're not familiar, a barrel, if I remember correctly, a barrel is a specific size. I don't remember the volume, but the size by volume of the barrel dictated what it was called. A hogshead had a specific barrel. There was a barrel called a butt, and that's where the expression butt load comes from. All of those had different volumes associated with them. Well, having stave material, and certainly whether it was meant to be watertight barrel, depending on what species you used. You could use white oak, but you can use red oak. Well, we had plenty of white oak. So we were starting to export barrel staves in a somewhat large scale. New England in particular, though, didn't have these cash crops like tobacco. They didn't have the climate. They didn't really have the flat land like the Piedmont of the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast and the Carolinas. But they had incredible forests. So colonists in the Massachusetts Bay Area and Maine started harvesting the region's kind of seemingly endless white pine, maple, mostly white pine though, because of its immense size and breadth. And by the 1650s, New England was shipping out lumber regularly, into overseas markets for shipbuilding. Mast and spar stock. That's what the white pine was being used for. And certainly they were exporting things like fish and farm goods, but lumber was kind of a part of everything. We'll talk a little bit later about how the lumber was shipped and why lumber was kind of the staple export material. A colonial writer in 1634 noted that Boston was already, quote, bare of wood, end quote, nearby, requiring residents to fetch firewood and timber by boat from further afield, indicating local deforestation in town centers had already begun as the region became a supplier of wood abroad. So they were cutting, obviously they cut nearby to establish the settlement. Then they started to cut a little bit like into the suburbs for export. Now the suburbs are gone and they had to go and establish the first logging camps out in the woods to continue to have export. But, the further and further afield you go, when you're dragging everything back by oxen and things like that, it got pretty expensive to deal with. European demand for timber was huge and continued to grow. Again, their forests were already depleted, like hundreds of years depleted. Centuries of shipbuilding and housing and farming in Britain had basically decimated those forests. So by the 17th century, they were already out of wood. So you can imagine now we're talking mid-17th century and this potential influx of resources from somewhere else, they were excited about it. So over a 50 to 60 year period, the colonies went from barely scraping by, barely surviving, until the late 17th century. The colonies, especially New England and like the Caribbean facing colonies, had already begun international markets for wood products in exchange for goods or credit, really marking the start of the lumber trade era. Like the first time in the history of the world, really, and even kind of large scale, the lumber trade had begun, we'll just say 1650 to 1660. So, the exported versus domestic use started already, the market began to segment at that point. So just as today, whether it's the US or Brazil or Indonesia or, the DRC, not all the tree species were valued equally in the timber trade. So certain species of wood were highly prized in Europe or somewhere abroad by modern stances, and then other foreign markets just weren't interested in the species, and those were mostly used in country, and in this case, used within the American colonies for everyday needs. So I kind of wanted to take some time to look at like the various tree species, what was its primary colonial use, staying domestic, was it exported? Was there export or domestic or both market? And really, what were the reasons behind those? So, the first one that really comes to mind is New England white pine, Pinus strobus. Probably should feature that as a species coming up. Primarily, certainly some for construction, but the biggest thing was ship masts. It was heavily exported, but also used locally for the same reason. We had tall, straight, and lightweight material that was ideal for ship masts and spar, which, of course, the British Navy urgently needed because the British Navy was always at war with somebody. White pine timber was also sawn into boards known as deal, quote, deal. If you've read anything like The Joiner Cabinet Maker by Lost Art Press, The Wheelwright Shop, The Artisan of Ipswich, all fantastic books, by the way. There's often mention of deal, D-E-A-L, like the New Deal. Deal. It was kind of common grade material, what we might think of as secondary material used for like case backs, drawer bottoms, possibly drawer sides. Deal. This was white pine, but it was a number of species, but white pine did comprise the conglomerate market trade name of deal. This was all exported to Europe, but also to the West Indies. White pine was extremely abundant in New England, so much that even after the exports, the colonists had plenty for house framing and barns. The largest pines, greater than 24 inches in diameter, were reserved by the crown and marked specifically for export with the sign of the broad arrow or the king's mark. And if you're watching the video, this is a modern day rendition taken from the Plymouth plantation colony. It's basically almost looks like a bear pulling its three toes together and crossing out in what was meant to be like a crude arrowhead shaped form. And the broad arrow notices, broad arrow axe. Really, it's one of the things that actually led up to the American Revolution. We hear about the Boston Tea Party all the time and the tea taxes that caused the Patriots to go and throw the tea overboard in Boston Harbor. Well, in 1772, 1768, we had pine tree riots. We had broad arrow riots, and these were mostly, I think, in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. These were local colonists who were upset over the taxation, but also the wholesale claiming of these white pine trees by the crown. These lumber merchants from the monarch would come in and they would slash that broad arrow mark, the king's mark, on these trees and say this is reserved for not specifically just the king, but the Royal Navy. These were meant to be ship mast trees. They were just called mast trees. And the colonists were like, well, hey, what if we want to use that for something else? Or what if we want to use that for our own shipbuilding? We'll talk a little bit about that later, but there was just as much shipbuilding going on in the colonies as there was in Britain. And you had people who were being arrested and fined for felling these trees, kind of like the story of Robin Hood and his merry men being fined for killing deer in Nottingham Forest. These guys were felling trees that had been marked by the broad arrow mark, and they were being arrested. They were being taxed inordinately, and a bunch of New Hampshireites got together and said, basically, screw you. And they ran the sheriff out of town on a rail, or in some instances, killed the sheriff. Running him out of rail is a bit anachronistic, isn't it? They killed the sheriff. And these were riots that were just as important to that kind of steam kettle leading up to the American Revolution. So it wasn't just the Stamp Act and tea taxes. It was also taxing and basically wholesale claiming of forests for the use by the British Royal Navy. So yeah, white pine was at the heart of that. Let's talk about other species. Oak, white and red oak, certainly used for houses, for clapboard, ship frames. So thinking of the actual frames in the hull, they needed really, really stout, strong timbers, but most importantly, barrel staves. So the white and red oak saw both an export and a domestic market. Certainly, stout, rot-resistant white oak was prized for ship hulls, for frames, but also watertight barrel staves for things like wine. The colonies exported huge numbers of oak staves and headings for barrel making in Europe and also the Caribbean for packing sugar and molasses. Red oak, which was more porous and not used for dry cask like transporting sugar, was likewise exported as staves. Domestically, oak was a workhorse wood used in house timber frames, flooring, fence posts. So the colonists kept a good share of that domestically for their own use. Coastal shipyards also used local oak for building vessels. We'll talk a little about that when we get into some regions here. Pitch pine, southern yellow pine, longleaf, loblolly, etc. That was primarily for naval stores, resin, and some construction. So heavily exported. A little bit for local use as we started building our own navy. The resin-rich pines, Pinus palustris, longleaf pine in the Carolinas were not as valued for lumber, but vital for naval stores. Tar, pitch, and turpentine. This is where the expression tar heel comes from. North Carolina specifically, one of their major exports was naval stores, tar, pitch, and turpentine from the longleaf pine. Colonists boxed these pines, so cut all the bark and everything off, and burned the logs to extract the tar and the pitch, and exporting tens of thousands of barrels of tar and pitch to Britain for sealing ships' rigging and hulls. By the 1760s, naval stores from southern pines were a major export of North Carolina alone, providing about 60% of their total export. Pitch pine wood itself was used domestically for rough construction and fuel, but was generally too knotty for high-grade lumber. Its value really continued to lay in the resin. Again, the tar heels. Excuse me. Moving on to cedar, both eastern red and Atlantic white cedar. This was shingles, cabinets, chest. So again, both a domestic and an export use. It was decay resistant and aromatic, so colonists used it locally for cedar for roofing, shingles, siding. It resisted rot in like New England's soggy weather roofs. Cedar was also used for furniture, or hope chests for its fragrance and for its like moth repelling nature. Red cedar from the swamps in the Carolinas and Virginia was occasionally exported to Bermuda, who prized it for shipbuilding early on. Some of the red cedar of Carolina was known in England for furniture, but mahogany kind of later eclipsed that as the triangle trade started up out of the West Indies. In general, cedar was a secondary export. Boston records show cedar logs harvested in Massachusetts. Swamps were sold to local cabinet makers. The bulk of the cedar served the domestic markets, though, for cedar shingles and interior woodwork rather than kind of large-scale export. And it's interesting enough, a lot of New England still lives and dies by cedar shakes. Ironically, it's all Western red cedar coming from Western Canada now, not the local cedar anymore. Maple and birch, major stocks in New England, used for furniture, fuel, tools, but pretty much all domestic, local use. These hardwoods not in demand overseas, widely used by the colonists for furniture and joinery, window, sash, doors, etc. Boston craftsmen built fine furniture from local maple and birch. Birch and beech also became standard firewood, still today, and charcoal sources. Since these species didn't really offer advantages for Europe and were really just too heavy to transport, they were really kept locally. Some maple boards might be traded between the colonies, but virtually none were sent back to Europe for these purposes. It really came down to being too heavy. So moving on to some other hardwoods, again, mostly New England colonies producing these, but black walnut and cherry, furniture, of course, interior woodwork, but interestingly enough, mostly domestic. The international trade in these two species didn't really kick in until much later. And again, we're really focusing on like Plymouth, early 17th century up until the Revolutionary War. Black walnut grew mainly in the middle and southern colonies, some in the northern colonies. It was a premium cabinet wood. It was not exported to Europe in raw form. Instead, it was shipped within the colonies. For example, walnut was shipped to Pennsylvania for the Philadelphia furniture market, or Virginia, Williamsburg, Richmond into the Carolinas, like the Charleston furniture movement, and then of course up into Boston as well. Think of fine, 18th century Queen Anne, neat and plain American furniture. It was a lot of walnut. Not as much mahogany just yet. The mahogany was still all going to Europe at that point, and Europe was still fascinated with mahogany, so the walnut hadn't really kicked in yet. So it was all internally. John Adams, second president of the United States, in 1774, noted that Boston's cabinet makers relied on walnut imported from the southern provinces almost exclusively. Cherry wood, similarly, was valued for furniture and used locally. New Englanders found it very good for the cabinet maker. These attractive hardwoods were largely consumed in America for fine furniture and interior paneling. Any transatlantic trade in them was very minimal. Like, we have some space left in the ship. Sure, cram in some cherry, cram in some walnut. Kind of like, let's see if we can whet the appetite of the European market. And eventually it worked because it did spin up. But that was really post-Revolutionary War. And a lot of that was whether it was due to mahogany kind of going out of favor design-wise, or restrictions on mahogany just due to competition from the French and the Spanish, who had, a lot of stranglehold on the Caribbean. The British kind of got crammed out of the Caribbean, and especially out of Central and South America. And the British kind of lost their hold on that. Yeah, that's another podcast. Moving on to other species. This was interesting to me. Live oak, Quercus virginiana. Shipbuilding timber and domestic use only. Live oak, if you've seen a live oak, very dense southern oak, sprawly branches all over the place. Today, it's kind of like abhorred by sawmillers because it's really difficult to dry. And it's also kind of a pain in the butt to work with. But that same curvy, sprawly nature of it made it great for ship ribbing. It was incredibly strong, incredibly rot resistant, and perfect for ship hulls. It wasn't shipped to England simply because the curved nature of it made it really hard to ship. And it was best used in colonial shipyards where you could take that curved shape and you could actually hew it into a hull shape right there in the yard. So all you had to do was carry it from where you felled the tree to the local yard. You didn't have to cram it into a ship hold, and it could possibly unbalance a ship. The southern colonies like Georgia and South Carolina reserved live oak for building, almost exclusively building vessels in America. Famously, the USS Constitution was built from Georgia live oak. That's the one still sitting in Boston Harbor today. The British Navy did eventually come around to prize live oak, but in the colonial area, they didn't extract much of it. They focused on the easier pine, mast, and spar exports. Thus, live oak was pretty much just local ship construction. Hemlock and spruce, general construction, mast, spruce, and again, for local shipbuilding. These evergreens were common in the Northeast. Hemlock was a coarse wood used for framing barn boards locally. It wasn't really durable enough for export markets. Hemlock bark was actually more valued for tanning leather, so it was kind of not for the timber. Spruce was occasionally used for smaller mast and spars when the pine wasn't available, and spruce logs might be shipped within the colonies or to the West Indies if convenient, but neither spruce nor hemlock was a significant direct export to Europe. They mostly served domestic building needs and smaller kind of schooner, not transatlantic ships, but maybe down the coast or across the Caribbean. Smaller spar and smaller mast was good for spruce and hemlock occasionally. Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, there are other kind of small species, but these were the big ones. And these were the ones that filled our forests. So we had to start looking at like processing these, to prepare lumber for export or even to local use. You felled the tree, but then, you could only haul that log so far. And as deforestation from the city centers moved out, the colonists had to fell the trees and saw the logs into board planks and shingles or split them for shingles and staves, kind of as close to felling as possible. So in early years, this was done by sheer muscle power. And I'm sure you guys have seen images of pit sawing. The image that I'm showing in the video actually comes from Colonial Williamsburg. So obviously this is a modern photo taken of a reenactment of pit sawing. But pit saw, one guy stood on top, another guy stood down in the pit, and they just had this giant saw that they moved vertically up and down. Other instances, they would build a frame where they didn't actually dig a pit, but a guy climbed up on top of the frame and a dude stood underneath it and ate sawdust all day as it came down on top of him. It was incredibly labor intensive to slice a log into a plank. This method was very slow, backbreaking, like definition of backbreaking, but it was how the Pilgrims produced their first clapboards for export back in 1621 on the Fortune. But that's also probably why they quickly realized, man, this takes a lot of time, and my house is falling over, or I'm freezing at night while I'm spending my days sweating shipping lumber off to England when I don't have a roof over my head. And that's what stopped it. Hand hewing with axes was certainly another technique for beams and simple planks. Colonists could split and hew timbers by hand, and many of the first exported wood products were semi-processed by such means. Kind of roughly squared timber balk. You might have heard the term cant, where you've just basically taken a log and squared it off. But a cant is sawn into shape, whereas a balk is much less refined, often hewed into axe form. I suppose you could make a case for a cant also being done by hewing, but a cant is just a little bit more refined than a balk. Timber balk would have been exported in balk form. Certainly clapboards and staves also could have been split and hewn. Fully round logs were just inefficient to ship, but also could roll around and shift the balance on a ship that could cause the sucker to capsize in high seas. Interestingly enough, though, mechanized sawing arrived very early in New England. I mean, I think the first instance of a bandsaw was in like the 1500s, I think in Germany. The colonists very quickly harnessed their plentiful water streams to power sawmills. And by 1633, a water power sawmill was operating on the Patapsco River, which is now the border between Maine and New Hampshire? Yes, New Hampshire. And the proprietor, John Mason, that they actually know, was the guy who ran that. This was one of the first sawmills in English America. From that point, sawmills basically spread like wildfire. Wherever there was water power and accessible timber, coastal riverside towns built mills to efficiently cut lumber for local building, but also for sale. And by the 1680s, there were over 20 water-powered sawmills running in southern Maine through New Hampshire across all of those massive white pine forests for making massed export for the Royal Navy. These early mills used water wheels and a simple kind of reciprocating up and down saw blade moved by a crank. Basically, they could do the work of dozens of men just by water power alone. So sawmill could obviously turn out far more planks in a day than a pit sawing team. This boost in productivity made colonial lumber much, much cheaper. In fact, the colonies were far ahead of the mother country here. In England, traditional guilds of hand sawyers resisted the adoption of sawmills for many, many years, fearing basically job loss. Think like the modern union issues that people have. These mills in Europe were relatively scarce, and where they existed, they were basically like vandalized and shut down by the guildmen to keep their jobs. In America, though, there were no such labor restrictions, no guilds, so millwrights were freely established to build water mills pretty much anywhere it was feasible. So in addition to these large sawmills, later in the 1700s, you certainly still had pit sawing crews persisting where places like a mill couldn't reach, but where there wasn't water, plantations in the South, for example, would set up local mills powered by wind. Even tide-powered mills could run a reciprocating saw. And into the 18th century, we had mechanized, water-powered or wind-powered, alternate-powered mills running all across the colonies from north to south along the eastern seaboard. So by processing these logs into lumber before shipping, these colonists could add value but would also reduce bulk. It's the same as today. Shipping logs today is incredibly expensive, also very difficult to balance. Cutting into boards, you could just cram more in. You could fill every nook and cranny of a ship. Barrel staves, for example, you split your oak logs and shave them to shape, became an export commodity unto themselves. In northern forests, the offcuts from some of these larger trees, the leftover was basically, hey, what are we going to do with it? Let's shape it into staves. So a huge pine was felled for the mast stock. Side slabs were trimmed off to get down to that mast stock, and those side slabs were turned into deal. They were turned into pipe staves, barrel staves, and New England merchants sold those abroad. In southern forests, the laborers burned the pine wood to make tar and pitch, and then what was left over from clearing to get to the good stuff was used for stave work and for timber. So the colonial lumber industry basically just steadily continued to industrialize and specialize through the 1600s and 1700s, way ahead of what Europe was already doing. And by the 18th century, sawmilling technology had advanced to include gang saws, where you had multiple blades working in concert, cutting multiple boards with a single pass of a log, and much, much quicker to turn into boards. This meant that colonies could meet large orders. The British Navy could order, in the early 1700s, could order thousands of pine boards of a specific dimension for a specific part on their ships and expect New England sawmills to deliver constantly, consistently in quantity. This mechanization is one reason why colonial-built wooden ships ended up being cheaper. The lumber was cut efficiently. New England's ready supply of milled lumber allowed Americans to build ships 30% cheaper than the British could in their own yards, which is why so much of that lumber that they said, yeah, we could export it or we could keep it locally and build ships here, which leads me to the next point. Lumber continued to be export, but lumber products were also being export. So how did you make your way across the Atlantic? Well, you filled it in ships. Well, if you could build the ship out of local lumber and then fill it with local lumber, you could ship that across, sell the lumber, then sell the ship and have no backhauling and 100% profit, no overhead. Fantastic. So, getting from forest to foreign port was kind of an engineering feat in and of itself, but colonial lumber camps and sawmills were inland along rivers. And this extended, into the 20th century, even to the 21st century. So huge logs, especially this ship mast wood, was dragged by oxen and then floated downriver into the tidewaters. In New Hampshire and Maine, crews assembled raft flotillas of logs to float them to coastal ports like Portsmouth. Smaller wood, like boards and staves, were loaded onto river barges and sloops. Essentially, the extensive river system in New England was our natural highways for moving timber from the cutting in the forests out to the port. And this could even continue into the summer by loading it onto sleds or running it over the frozen rivers and things. In the port, though, the colonial port towns like Boston, Portsmouth, Philadelphia, Charleston even, lumber was a major outgoing cargo. So these ports were routinely stacked high with piles of boards, barrel staves, squared timbers awaiting shipment. Because lumber is bulky and heavy, it was actually used as ballast, an essential part of these ships. So European vessels would arrive to North America, offload their goods, and then they would need ballast. So they would take on tons of timber just to balance the hulls for the return voyage. So specialized coastal schooners and sloops also operated to collect wood from various ports and bring them to large collection yards like Philadelphia. To this day, Philadelphia is still a major collection port for lumber, as is Norfolk. So all these smaller harbors that were still floating logs downstream, these specialized lumber schooners staying inland in the coastal tidewaters, intercoastal waters inside the Barrier Islands, would transport that up to these major ports for transatlantic shipment. The largest single pieces of wood, like mast logs, were transported for the Royal Navy. Each mast could be 2 to 3 feet in diameter and over 100 feet long. So this was just way too large to fit in the hold of a normal ship. So the British Navy developed specialized mast ships, quote unquote mast ships, to carry these spar and mast material. Starting in the 1650s, the British Admiralty sent convoys of mast ships to New England. These vessels were equipped to handle these long timbers, often lashed them to the deck or sticking out over the bow or the stern, and a single mast ship might carry dozens of pine trunks per voyage. One account shows 4,500 prime mast logs were transported from America to England under the Crown's program between 1691 and 1775. The last of these heavy shipments left just before the Revolution began. And then we kept them all to build our own navy, which came back to bite them later. You had specialized ships, but then everything else was just lumber cargo. So boards, planks, staves was loading and packing as tightly as possible to prevent shifting during a sea voyage. So ships of the day, brigs, schooners, larger merchantmen had these deep holds, and the stevedores would stack sawn boards in the hold from keel all the way up to the deck, filling every available space. Oak staves were bundled and packed into holds. Timber could be strapped on the deck if needed, although exposure to sea spray was a bit of a problem. I've actually found some ledgers from my company from the mid-1700s, because we were officially founded in 1740. Our official corporation is 1798 because, war, country didn't exist, Constitution had to be formed, all that before you could actually incorporate it as an American company. So it had to wait till 1798 to officially incorporate, but we were in business since the 1740s. And I've got some ledgers from the mid-1700s that note New England pine boards were regularly shipped to the West Indies as well as Europe, carried by American-built merchant ships. And these boards could serve not only as ballast, but also cargo simultaneously. So the transatlantic voyage from the East Coast port to England was about 4 to 6 weeks. Lumber cargoes were relatively low value per weight, though. So they were often part of the triangle trade. So rather than sole purpose trips, for example, a New Englander might carry a load of boards and staves to the Caribbean, and then exchange them for molasses or sugar, which paid better per volume, and then carry that sugar to Europe. However, there were still direct routes. American ships carrying lumber, tobacco, rice, and fish directly to Britain also had lumber on board as part of that just standard colonial trade system. On arrival in England or elsewhere, the wood would be sold to shipyards, coopers, and just various merchants. But, shipping wood even today has its hazards. Wood is certainly combustible. There are cases of tar and turpentine catching fire at sea. Wood can absorb water. So a load of green timber might arrive moldy or heavier from seawater. You can actually capsize a ship. Colonists did learn to season timber, at least air dry it, before shipping whenever possible, just to reduce weight and prevent warp and rot. High value masts, though, were often painted and greased for protection on the voice, and there was no loss of moisture, so they remained heavy. But still, the economic risk was relatively low since wood was still inexpensive to obtain in the colonies. Lots of it. Mechanization allowed it cheap to produce, so the overall value of lumber continued low. And this has continued into the 1950s and 60s, honestly, up until COVID. Some of our domestic species had been at the same price since the 1950s, and it only changed in COVID when everything spiked, and it's dropped since COVID, but not back to the level of the 1950s, thank goodness, because everything else overhead has gone up dramatically. But transporting lumber across the ocean relied upon the fact that ships need weight for ballast. So lumber, although not as glamorous as tobacco or tea or spices, it made the perfect filler cargo. So New England built a large fleet of merchant ships that carried timber abroad. A significant portion of that lumber export ended up being carried on American-built vessels. And like I said, sometimes they sold the ship itself when it got to its destination port, making it a very profitable business. So, in short, wood rode the holds of nearly every trading vessel leaving colonial ports, whether as ballast and cargo or specifically as a product. Rafting to the ports, specialized mast ships, dense packing and holds was basically the backbone of logistics back then, allowing the colonies to turn this massive resource into a transatlantic industry and a full commodity market. So during the 1700s, we started to see greater maturation of the trade. The colonial lumber industry expanded dramatically in scale. A great deal of sophistication in the mechanization, but also geographic scope and establishment of specialized markets allowed several trends during this maturation. So first was regional diversification. Each region of the eastern seaboard found a niche based upon their species. So New England was the powerhouse of timber. Limitless white pine forests, numerous sawmills, robust seafaring infrastructure. New England exported sawn lumber, boards, and planks in huge quantities, as well as the byproducts, shingles, barrel staves, and of course, one of the primary things, mast logs. It became a ship exporting center because they were building ships just as fast as the raw wood. So New England shipyards built vessels, sold them to the British merchants. By the 1770s, about 1/3 to 1/2 of the ships in Britain's merchant fleet were American built, all made in New England. As you move down to the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, these had good timber resources, especially upstate New York and Pennsylvania's kind of interior. They used a lot of wood for their own farms, mills, ironworks, but also exported some of it. Pennsylvania in particular turned its timber towards making barrel staves and headings to supply the sugar islands and the wine trade as part of the triangle trade. The abundance of Pennsylvania hardwoods supported a thriving furniture trade. Much of it stayed domestic, as I said earlier, in Philadelphia, like with the walnut. But some of the finished goods, like furniture, began to be exported, and we started to see a thriving market for American-made furniture in Britain and in Europe. As you move further south into the Chesapeake region, where I am, Maryland and Virginia, these colonies were heavily focused on tobacco and grain, cash crops. But they had substantial forests too. Early on, much of Tidewater, Virginia was just cleared for plantations, tobacco plantations. By the 18th century, though, the Tidewater, Maryland was cutting so much timber for shipbuilding, barrel making, and hogshead making for the tobacco trade that its supplies near the Tidewater were exhausted. And it forced Maryland, to start importing wood from other colonies around about the mid-1700s, 1760 really. The Chesapeake exported some ship masts and yard timber, like the Royal Navy occasionally took Virginia spars for smaller masts, local ships and such. When New England sources were stretched, which did happen occasionally, Chesapeake's biggest wood export might have been the oak staves, though, for tobacco hogsheads. Every tobacco every tobacco barrel or hogshead used 20 plus oak staves, often made from local wood. So any excess stave production always had a place where you could ship it. As you move further south into the Carolinas and Georgia, that was naval stores, all naval stores. The Tar Heels, particularly North Carolina, produced tar, pitch, and turpentine at an industrial scale by the mid-century. Britain's incentives and navigation acts put tax exemptions on naval stores for export. So their naval needs made these resin products incredibly valuable. And North Carolina's Cape Fear area was exporting thousands of barrels annually of tar. South Carolina also exported tar, but they also had a cypress and cedar shingle trade. Georgia, a little bit later, because it wasn't found until the 1730s, kind of got a late start, but it tapped its pine forest for naval stores and timber, and then particularly live oaks for pines, live oaks and pines of the Sea Islands as well for local shipbuilding. So by the eve of the Revolution, we had this regional diversification, but now we had larger trade volumes. Wood products have become an important, although maybe not top tier export for the colonies. It kind of, well, let's just put things in perspective. The combined mainland colonies export, all of the goods, was worth like 3 million pounds by the early 1770s. Of that, the biggest earners were the cash crops, tobacco, bread, grains, etc. Lumber and its products, while critical in volume, weight, for example, pine boards were worth about 70,000 pounds per year, 70,000 British pounds, not weight, British pounds, sterling, per year. Wooden barrel staves and headings were about 65,000 British pounds per year, together about 135,000 pounds. Lumber represented 4 to 5% of the mainland colony's financial export value, but by volume, by weight, it was the largest export. And when you think about its role in the cash crops, in making the barrels that held the tobacco and the sugar and the rice and the wheat, lumber was a major, major export. We're also forgetting about the ships that the lumber was built out of. So let's kind of look at this over time. We have 3 commodity markets. You've got tar, pitch, naval stores. You've got white pine masts, and then sawn lumber. And that could include, staves and construction lumber, etc. 1700s, very limited tar and pitch export. White pine masts, we're talking dozens of exports, just dozens. Sawn lumber, very small scale, few mills are exporting them. Before 1705, colonial naval store trade was minimal, mass trade was just beginning, and the Admiralty was just kind of discovering what was possible. So we moved to 1710 to 1715, we went from very limited naval stores to 7,000 barrels per year on average, up to about 25,000 barrels per annum by 1715. When it comes to masts, we went from dozens of masts to 50 to 100 per year by 1715. Sawn lumber, New England pine boards was increasing to 7 million board feet per year. The Bounty Act was in full swing at this point. Southern colonies began to ramp up tar production because that Bounty Act essentially was tax exempt. Mass contracts were in regular place. So now we had sawmills expanding and growing with specific Royal Navy Admiralty contracts here. Moving to the 1740s, our naval stores went from about 25,000, it doubled to 50,000 barrels per year by the late 1730s. Masts were over 100 shipping per year, and timber was a steady export of 10 to 20 million board feet a year from New England. So again, further growth. Britain was heavily reliant upon colonial tar and pitch. New England and Nova Scotia were supplying most of the masts at this point. Go forward to like 1760, 1768-ish. We're now 135,000 barrels of tar, pitch, and turpentine. So we've tripled since the 1740s. Now we're at 120 to 150 masts per year, right up until before the Revolution kicked off. New England was shipping tens of millions of board feet of sawn lumber, about 70,000 pounds worth. So peak output at this point, 1768 was listed as our peak output. Southern naval stores at max, this was the Tar Heel dominance we talk about. Lumber was a staple export from New England, also exporting 70,000 pounds worth of boards and 65,000 pounds, again, British sterling pounds, in staves yearly. Now we get to 1775. So 1768 was that peak. Then we started to get pine riots and the Tea Party and stuff like that. Started basically unrest. People unhappy. Colonists were like, what are you doing over there, King George? We're not happy with this. So 1775, all trade stops. So we go from 135,000 barrels of tar to zero. War embargo in 1775. 150 masts per year to zero. The last shipment of masts left the port of Philadelphia in July of 1775. We go from tens of millions of board feet of sawn boards to zero to England and a little bit down to the West Indies until even that was blocked. The Revolutionary War basically halts legal trade. The British scramble for Baltic tar. The colonies keep our lumber for our own shipbuilding, for our own war efforts at this point. So in the decades leading up to the American Revolution, the lumber industry had become well established, regionally specialized, to the point where we still see that specialization today by species. New England was all about white pine. The middle colonies were selling wood products, oak, staves, cypress. The South was extractives, pitch, tar, turpentine. When the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, the transatlantic trade was disrupted. Colonial export economy, including lumber, came to an abrupt stop. So yeah, British forces were kind of SOL at that point, and the Continental Army and the Continental Navy was founding. We're thinking, no, we're not going to send this to our enemy. We're going to build our own ships out of it. We're going to supply the French and the Spanish, who are going to beat up on the British on another front. So yeah, the British had to go to other sources at this point. They turned to certainly the Baltic states, but also Canada and Florida for some of the more loyalist-controlled areas. So really, from the first, let's go back, the first Pilgrim sawyers splitting clapboards and massive pine to these massive pine rafts floating down main rivers, the lumber industry from the American colonies grew into a critical component of our colonial economy. And it started the lumber trade globally. It supplied raw material that literally and figuratively built the colonies. From houses and wagons to ships and barrels, internationally, colonial timber filled the gap left by Europe's depleted forests, earning the colonies a reputation as Britain's timber quarry. By the 1760s and 1770s, American wood was found in Royal Navy's mighty ships, in the sugar casks of the Caribbean, wine barrels of the Madeira, and the hulls of hundreds of ships crossing the seas. The industry's maturation is just kind of epic. It brought challenges, certainly resource depletion in some locales, attempts at crown control, like those pine tar riots and pine tree riots. Ultimately, the timber industry became entangled. Lumber exports were paused. Foundation has been laid, though, for a greater American timber trade in the 19th century. And maybe in a future episode, we'll talk about that when things really exploded, but then also when things started to go south from a sustainability perspective, kind of the dark history of the American timber trade. That machine that denuded forests across the eastern United States and began to spread into the western United States, that machine was founded in this era that we just talked about. And it only grew smarter, faster, and, well, maybe not smarter, but faster and stronger at this point. The colonial era had transformed wood from a frontier necessity into a market commodity, into a major export trade, establishing practices, networks, and expertise that has endured, today, until today. And we still see that kind of export. Now our major exports are, Japan, China, the Middle East. Certainly we're still seeing European exports, but now we've moved on to these other countries. Japan and China are major importers of North American lumber, and certainly the Middle East as well. So that was, we'll just call it a expansive look at the history of colonial lumber, but it was kind of fascinating to me, and it plays nicely into our little pilgrim continuation of our Pilgrim's pride on this. So I will leave you with this thought. that were it not for a few enterprising lumbermen on the Mayflower and shipping into Jamestown and other American colonies, we may not have a timber trade today. It had to start somewhere, and somebody had to figure out that there was something that could be done with these large markets. There was something that could be done with an export, and how to export it, and how to mechanize it, and how to create an efficient way of moving a very heavy product overseas. And that was the foundation that we built our entire lumber trade on today. So when you go buy some lumber this month, think about how little has changed from the early 1600s to how we buy lumber and how we even export lumber today. Who we're exporting it to may be different. The speed with which we export it may be different, but how we pack our hulls, how we rely upon dunnage and ballast in ships is the same as it was in the 1600s and the 1700s. So when you're sitting there stuffing your face with turkey and then waddling down to your wood shop after the fact to work off those calories with a hand plane and a saw, maybe the first Pilgrims did the same thing after the first Thanksgiving. They had to waddle next door to their shop and work off those calories by sawing boards that could eventually be exported on a ship to the mother country. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time.